Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò at New York University. I am Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm really happy to be introducing this special evening, very special. I will try to be as brief as possible because I think we all wish to get to the core of our event tonight. I just wish to say on behalf of the Department of Italian Studies at NYU that we are truly delighted to be launching this new lecture series named after our late colleague, Professor John Freccero, whose vision has made it possible for our department to become, over the years, one of the leading self-standing programs in Italian studies in North America. Unfortunately, I haven't had the pleasure to meet Professor Freccero in person, though as all of us in the field of Italian studies, of course, have learned a good deal from his scholarship. His presence is still very strong among these walls. I've heard a lot about him from both colleagues and former students of Professor Freccero's, many of whom are now colleagues at other universities around the country. And I was very moved by many of them who actually reached out to cheer this initiative. I received many emails of former students of Professor Freccero saying that they were really delighted that we are honoring the memory of Professor Freccero with this lecture series. I must say that I'm really honored to be chairing this department at the very moment when we launch this lecture series. But I wish to stress that the restructuring of our guest lecture series and the rebranding of it as the John Freccero lecture series is the result of beautiful teamwork done by the faculty in the department, and I want to thank all my wonderful colleagues for their contribution to thinking about ways of honoring Professor Freccero while also brainstorming about, how to design this lecture series. And just to give you a sense of what we came up with, the idea is to host 4 lectures per year on different aspects of Italian studies, always including a moment for our graduate students to meet with our guests. And we believe that one of the key aspects of John Freccero's legacy on top of his scholarship is the notion that good scholarship stems from mentoring, conversations, and intellectual exchange. So, I like to think that he would appreciate the idea of including this sort of mentoring/teaching moment in this lecture series. We will have 4 lecture series. We begin tonight with a very special guest. I won't say anything about her now because she will be introduced in a bit. I just would like to say that all this wouldn't be possible without the enthusiasm and support of Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò, and especially of its director and beloved colleague, Professor Stefano Albertini. Also, on behalf of all of us, I cannot overstate our gratitude towards Dr. Thomas Bellezza and Mr. John Jensen for supporting this initiative. Your help means the world to us. Let me also thank Paola Freccero, one of the children of Professor Freccero, who is kindly sort of joining us tonight representing the family. And we also have 2 cousins of Professor Freccero's, which is also, wonderful. So we have really a sort of big part of the family with us tonight. So without further ado, I will hand it over to my colleague Stefano Albertini, who will say a few words. Then we will have Paola Freccero herself sharing some remarks, and then my colleague Professor David Forgash will introduce Professor Penny Marcus, who will be giving the lecture. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Eugenio. Eugenio is great. He really fits into the shoes of John Freccero as chair of this department. He's the youngest chair of department at New York University, and he's doing a terrific job. Thank you, Eugenio. I'm going to try to make it short. There is a full article that I wrote for you when you leave or when you arrive. I don't know whether they give it to you already. But I figured that in a lecture series dedicated to John, you might want to hear something about him. And this is going to be my very personal little portrait of John. I always addressed him formally and called him Professore, even though he had invited me countless times to call him John and use the tu with him. I tried, and I would start with John, but by the second sentence, I was back to Professore. We laughed and continued our conversation, and no matter what the topic was, it was never dull or boring. From American to Italian politics, from medieval theology to liberation theology, from Ferragamo ties to our beloved Florence, from his childhood memories as an Italian-American boy in Queens, to the memorable sayings of his sharp-witted Sicilian mother, Concetta, to the accomplishments of Francesca, Carla, Stephen, and Paula, his children, of whom he was immensely proud. John Freccero's story is an epic American tale and a romantic Italian story, a quintessential New York story. The story of a maestro whose teaching legacy lives on, si eterna, as Dante would have said, through the dozens of his students who followed in his footsteps and continued to teach, and echo, without imitating him, his teaching style from the lecturns of the most prestigious Italian, British, and American universities. His mother, Concetta, was a Sicilian seamstress and member of the Ladies' Garment Union, proud member of the Ladies' Garment Union, right, Paola? And his father, Alfredo, a Genoese barber. They met in the shadow of Washington Square Arch and were married at Our Lady of Pompeii Church, where he was baptized with the name Giovanni, and we had a mass today at Our Lady of Pompeii by Father Dimo, that now gives the name to the square in front of the church. In his later days in New York, from the windows of his apartment, he could gaze upon the arch under which his story began. Then came the move to Queens, public schools, because Concetta said the Irish nuns mistreated Italian kids. And then Brooklyn Tech, the public high school for the brightest students. John was unique, but also consciously part of a generation that included Bob Giamatti, his friend at Yale, Mario Cuomo, the Scorseses, the Faucis, the Coppolas, people like Dr. Bellezza, who is helping us out in this lecture series, Geraldine Ferraro, Italian-American boys and girls, who were the first in their families to enter the most prestigious colleges and universities. Families of hard-working people who saw in their children's education a path to redemption and a chance to assert their dignity. Families that celebrated their children's success without exaggeration or bragging. John's mother, at the party for his PhD, whispered to him, "Ah, if only you were a real doctor." And Mario Cuomo's mother, in parallel, at his swearing-in ceremony as governor of New York State, said to him, "Ah, if only you had become a judge." John Freccero was Italian, was American, he was a New Yorker, he was a Californian, he was a Florentine. These were just some of John Freccero's identities, and he was perfectly comfortable with each of them. His innate elegance came from his ability to always be himself. At Stanford, with his friends, the immortal French academiciens René Girard and Michel Serres, in New York, with his Sicilian barber Franco, here in the village, in Florence, with the artisans in Piazza Santo Spirito. And John knew Florence, and I have to tell you something about John and Florence, like few others, and loved it passionately. He loved its millennial history, its widespread beauty, its popular and even vulgar soul. I share with you this short paragraph from one of the messages, the many messages that he wrote to me from Florence. I believe it captures, in some way, his view of the world. This is John. I have become such an habitué at I Quattro Leoni in Piazza della Passera. They now give me the artigiano menu. Its prefix, 16,000 lire. I feel very much like one of the Popolo Minuto. The artisans around here work very hard. I never realized how hard. There is a man who, I swear, polishes and restores silver for 14 hours a day. They're good, decent, skillful people who I thought were supposed to no longer exist. Maybe the Japanese make the troiai in the mercato, and the artisans export directly to Japan. Many colleagues celebrate Freccero's scholarship, and I'm not going to go to that tell you all his publication and his interest, and probably in the lecture series, little by little, we'll explore some of these aspects. But I just want to summarize that John opened new frontiers in the study of Dante studies, with the precision of a philologist and the intellectual freedom of a philosopher. Without detracting from Dante's Thomism, his devotion to Thomas Aquinas, John reassessed and exalted the role of St. Augustine in Dante's Poetics and made conversion the key to interpreting the Divine Comedy. He didn't write thousands of pages. He himself joked that with today's quantitative publication criteria in American academia, he would have struggled to get a professorship. But each one of his essays on the most diverse subjects on Italian culture, from Petrarch's Fig Tree and the Laurel to Antonioni's Blow Up, and we are going to hear about this from Penny tonight, from Machiavelli's Caterina da Forlì to Svevo's Last Cigarette, each of them has become a point of reference and a stumbling block for a generation of scholars to come. But Freccero was and remains above all a teacher, a maestro, in the definition given by the most revolutionary teacher of 20th century Italy, the Florentine priest Lorenzo Milani. A maestro, Don Milani says, is someone who studies in order to teach, not for himself. Freccero loved teaching and generously shared what he knew with his students. The dozens of research ideas he offered in every lesson, the references ranging from the church fathers to American pop culture, the daring and improbable connections between authors and texts that by the end of the lesson seem so obvious and logical, and his legendary negative reading list, the books you could do without reading. These were some of the ingredients that made him a unique professor. These ingredients plus something undefinable, something close to the sublime, what the pseudo-Longinus said, per ipsos, the sublime, the ability through feelings and words to transcend the human condition and approach greater mystery. We will be eternally grateful to our maestro, John Freccero, for having opened cracks of light into that mystery and for having us made a glimpse through that luce intellettual piena d'amore, amor di vero ben, pien di letizia, letizia che trascende ogni dolçore. Thank you. Paolo.
Unlike my father, I need notes, so I do not have his gift for extemporaneous speaking. As Stefano said, I am Paola. I am John Freccero's youngest child. And on behalf of my siblings, Carla, Stephen, and Francesca, I'd like to thank you, and thank you, Stefano, thank you to the Casa Italiana, to the Department of Italian Studies at NYU, and to all of you for this amazing and lovely tribute to my father. I can't help but imagine my father looking around this room, surveying the scene. Those of you who know him well will know what I mean when I say that he'd be taking note of who is here, but he'd be taking even greater note of who isn't. When my father decided to retire from NYU in 2015, he said it was because he was starting to lose his words. We were tempted to dismiss it as the self-criticism of a pretty proud man who was feeling his age. But it turns out he knew something was wrong. What he was facing was actually aphasia, the first sign of the dementia that would take over and ultimately take his life. I lived with him. I'm going to try and get through this without crying. I lived with him as his caregiver for most of the last 5 years of his life. For much of that time, he was still him. He was still the boy from Queens, the Brooklyn Dodgers fan who would cringe when he heard an aluminum bat hit a ball. That's just wrong. That's just not baseball, he used to say. He could still break into songs from his childhood. This one might ring a bell to some of you older Italian Americans. Where do you work, John? The Delaware Lackawanna. What do you do, John? I push, I push, I push. One of his favorites. Can't explain it. We shared an encyclopedic knowledge and love of movies and a fascination with celebrity gossip. We both admired the white pelicans in the Palo Alto Baylands, and we both preferred Caddy K on the BBC World News over Laura Trevelyan. My siblings and I would read out loud to him. Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man was a favorite. Have you ever tried to read James Joyce out loud? Yeah, it's not easy. We tried as best we could to keep a connection between him and the world. But as his youngest child, who didn't have any early education in Italy, not that I'm bitter, who speaks Italian barely at the level of a preschooler, who has an undergrad degree in psychobiology and a career in business, I wasn't exactly equipped to keep him connected to his scholarship. And he really didn't want anyone other than family to see him in what he felt like was a diminished capacity. So little by little, he was less and less Freccero, il professore, il maestro, or as he used to call himself, the 800-pound gorilla. Where does the 800-pound gorilla sit? Anywhere he wants to. He lost a lot of his relationship with Dante and Machiavelli and Petrarch and St. Augustine and all the other poets he had spent so many years studying. But just in case this feels like the world's most depressing tribute, please know that there is a happy ending, because here we are in the city that was his true home, celebrating the literature and the language that fueled his mind and his soul, with his students and his grandstudents, and maybe even some great-grandstudents who are his legacy. You are the links that connect John Freccero the man and John Freccero the scholar. This series is his enduring connection to his life of scholarship. And for that, his children, his grandchildren, and all of us who loved him are truly grateful. So thank you.
I can't follow that, but my job is to introduce the speakers, so that's easier, I think. I'll try and make this brief because I'm sure we all want to hear Professor Marcus's talk. I just wanted to say, not do the kind of conventional summary of her publications, that would take half an hour anyway, but just to say a personal comment about my admiration for her work and something about this lecture. There was a kind of I only just established this, that Penny Marcus, everybody calls her Penny, but I'll call you Penny, overlapped with John Freccero twice. First when you were an undergraduate at Cornell, and then when you were a graduate student at Yale. And it was when you were at Yale that he gave a lecture, which I think then became an essay, published in the journal Theatre in 1970, on Blow Up. Now, unfortunately, when I was asked by Criterion Collection to write the booklet essay on Blow Up, which we presented here in this room, we presented the restoration disc. We had a great, an audience full of people, and actually said to them, how many of you have seen Blow Up before? And everybody put up their hand. And then I said, how many of you have seen it? Did you see it when it first came out in 1967, I think it was, in the US? And about half the audience put up their hand. So that says something about the average age of the audience for that screening. and me as well, because I also saw it when it came out. But I didn't know that John had written an essay on Blow Up when I wrote my thing, and I wish I had, because it's such a, as we're going to hear, such a kind of complex and interesting essay, also very challenging, very erudite, not easy to follow. I hope Penny will elucidate it for us, because there's some difficult bits in it. But I didn't know that he had an interest in movies, that he wrote about movies. He didn't write a lot about movies. That's the only piece of his that I'm aware of that he wrote about, published about a film. But it's an extraordinary piece of writing. What I want to say about Penny Marcus and my admiration for her work is to use a metaphor. What she's done in her career is as a film historian, because she started off as a graduate student, and then her first book was about Boccaccio's Decameron. So, she moved from Freccero, the main territory of John Freccero, into something that he dabbled in, and then she became really an expert in film studies and film history. But what I find interesting about her work is, and exciting, is that all of her books, from the very first one, Italian film, The Light of Neorealism, which was 1986, to the most recent one, which came out last year, Italian film in the present tense, I think it's called, is that she's been kind of photographing these different moments, really, of what's been happening in Italian cinema. The most recent one looks at the way that there's a cinema of social commitment, I think we can call it, in Italy, which looks at issues of migration, looks at problems of organized crime. Women are becoming more prominent as filmmakers. So she's capturing that moment. But an earlier book written around, I think published in the early 2000s after Fellini, looks at that moment when cinema's in crisis. Television has taken over in the Berlusconi years, 1980s, 90s, as the dominant medium, the one that's most watched. Cinema has moved into a kind of secondary place. But what Penny claims in that book is that cinema retains its importance as a social medium, a medium of social engagement and of moral commitment, where television is much more vapid and entertainment-driven. So each of the books, as I say, photographs that moment of the evolution of Italian cinema in an extraordinary way. There's also a great lucidity in her writing. She's a beautiful writer, very, very clear. Pretty much all of the books take a film per chapter and explain it. Even if you haven't seen it, it gives you a very clear picture of what the film is about. She's very good on character. She's very good on narrative. So I've learned a lot from reading her. So I want to say I'm very excited to have her here. She's familiar with this place, but to have her back talking about a film. Or about actually a scholar reading a film that we've all seen. I just wanted to say just one more thing about the blow-up, that actually I have Stefano Albertini to thank for telling me that John Freccero wrote an essay on blow-up, and I wish he told me that before I wrote my essay, which, by the way, if you're interested, you can read. If you just Google Forgach blow up, you can read it online. You can also see the video of when we presented it, the discussion with Kim Hendrickson. But I wish I'd known about this, because I would have said something about it. It deals with issues in that film which I really hadn't understood were there. The fixation on death, the question of youth and trying to recapture your youth through sex is there. And it's in the film. It's obvious when you look at it after having read the essay, but it wasn't clear to me at the time. So mea culpa. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Penny Marcus. I'm sure you've had enough hors d'oeuvre now onto the main course, talking about the lecture that changed my life. Penny Marcus.
Well, first of all, I think the hors d'oeuvres were better than the main course will be. That was just a wonderful repast that you gave us, a banquet. And I just want to say thank you so much, David, for that very generous and I think very insightful introduction. And Paula, it was just so moving, just beyond moving, really, what you said. Eugenio, thank you so much for the invitation and for being such a wonderful host. Stefano, and thank you for your wonderful, wonderful remarks. Again, very, very, very moving. And also, I want to thank in advance Julian Sachs, who is the projectionist and who put up with my last-minute requests for clips and adding the clips. So without him, I would not be able to show you the wonderful footage that I think is so important to understand blow up. And can you all hear me, by the way? Am I okay? If I talk too fast, which happens when I'm excited and emotional, which is now, please let me know. Go like this, and if you can't hear me, go like this. Okay. So thanks again. I'm so moved. I was overwhelmed to get the invitation and to be able to have this opportunity, which is a daunting opportunity for me, to honor John Freccero. And I hope that what I'm going to say now and show you will show how much I'm indebted to him, what an impact he's had on my life, both as a person and as a professional. So you know the title of my lecture here, and I can pinpoint the exact moment of my conversion to Italian cinema studies. It happened in spring 1970 when Freccero delivered the lecture that would form the basis then of that beautiful essay, entitled, and this is important, Blow Up, From the Word to the Image. This was a career-defining event for me, obviously. The whole idea that my professor of Dante studies, who had led me through the venerable pathways of medieval philosophy, theology, and poetics, to arrive at the reading of the Commedia as a kind of summa of Western thought, and that would be a kind of touchstone for subsequent Italian cultural achievement, that John Freccero would turn his attention to any film, let alone a film about mod London in the 1960s. This struck me with the force of revelation. couldn't believe it. It was overwhelming, that in and of itself. So we're talking about a time in the Academy when film studies was unthinkable within the liberal arts. It was not considered an object of serious study at all. It was taught in these sort of vocationally tainted schools of communication. I don't believe that at all, but that's what it was considered within the halls of liberal arts. To take cinema as the object of serious inquiry, worthy of credit towards a bachelor's degree. So Freccero's talk marked for me the beginning of a turning around, or the conversionary experience that you talked about, Stefano, that was at the center of his teaching and his writing. If anything, it was a turning around that was really involved a turning away from the idea of the movie screen as the back wall of Plato's cave, as the place of mystification, illusionism that diverts us from seeking the truth. And so sorry, I missed a page here. Freccero's analysis broke down the either-or distinction between film and literary text, between cinema as a shadowy simulacrum of the material world and the written word as a step towards enlightenment. In making blow up the focus of his most impassioned interpretive scrutiny, Freccero gave his benediction to the film medium as the vessel for working through the anxiety that had always plagued the mimetic arts, from Plato on, with their power to seduce us away from the path of pure knowledge. Cinema brings that anxiety to a head, thanks to its technologically driven claim to reproduce the real, in quotes. But self-conscious filmmakers build into their art an awareness of the equivocal powers of illusion that the technology puts at their disposal. Bertolucci does so at the end of The Conformist, literally enacting the myth of Plato's cave as an allegory for the mechanisms of filmic projection. And so, with Julian's help, I'd like to show you a clip from the film's very final frames, which include all of the ingredients of Plato's scenario, but positioned in such a way as to confound any easy reading of the analogy it suggests. Everything will be there: the grotto in the Colosseum, facade, the fire, the prison bars, the shadowy object of desire, and someone who looks. So, Julian, if we can have that first clip, that would be great. Those are the final frames, and I hope you notice that Marcello turns around and looks straight at the camera. This is a violation of the fourth wall of theatrical illusion. He's making contact with us as the viewers, and he's showing us our own position within the cave of cinema. It's being exposed by that gaze into the camera at us. So film may be a mere exercise in illusionism, Bertolucci is saying here, but it also has the power to unmask and examine its status as lie. Antonioni will do this in Blow Up by challenging the basis of cinema's truth claims, as Freccero's essay has clearly led me to understand. So he was writing this in 1970 without the benefit of DVD technology to analyze the workings of filmic signs. Freccero then was not prompted to think on the molecular level about the relationship between the word and the image of his essay's subtitle. But this was all to the good, I think, because it enabled him to zoom out then and to take the measure of cinema's place within the hierarchy of the arts, that is, no longer consigned to an inferior rung on the scale of importance, but to a place of equal dignity and weight in relation to its literary counterpart. But I need to say at this outset that the essay subtitle, From the Word to the Image, does not refer to the cinematic adaptation of the short story by Julio Cortázar that loosely inspired the film. And when I was speaking to graduate students this afternoon, Leonardo had mentioned the fact that he had reread that story by Cortázar, and maybe during the Q&A he can talk about it. That would be great. But in any event, the word then for Freccero stands for something far more expansive and consequential than merely the text from which the film was adapted. For Freccero, the word meant the Western literary tradition writ large, that is, the repository of learning and insights which fueled his magisterial reading of Antonioni's work. Freccero's inquiry, like the film's protagonist Thomas, involved blowing up his object of inquiry to the uppermost regions of critical thought, as I hope then to show you in what I'll be saying in the following. That lecture on that spring evening of 1970, in that lecture, I heard much that echoed his classes on poetry of the Duecento, on Dante, on Petrarch, and even on his course in the 20th century Italian novel. Echoes that showed how many serious literary topoi were embedded in the imagery of Blow Up. And just to give you some examples, the park where Thomas photographs the lovers as a locus amanus in all its possible incarnations, the Garden of Love with its mirrors of Narcissus, the Arcadian place infiltrated by death, Thomas's post-orgy recognition of the corpse, literalized in the Petit Mort of erotic poetry, the blow-up process which leads Thomas on the equivalent of the medieval journey intra nos, the concluding antics of the mimes that reenact the demonic tennis game of Don Quixote, and the image culture that threatens to seal us in the closed world of Petrarchan self-reflexivity. Freccero found all this in Blow Up. But the film's literariness, according to Freccero's reading, inheres not just in learned recalls, not just in the invocation of canonical texts and poetic traditions. Blow Up's summons to literary scrutiny arises from its own literal level, from the material book that lies at the heart of Thomas's artistic project. In the scene with his editor, Ron, which we're just going to look at in just a minute, at the restaurant, we learn that Thomas's fashion photography is really a foil for his aspiration to a financially disinterested and socially engaged practice of photorealism. Get this next page here. His day job merely serves to subsidize the higher calling revealed in the volume of images that threatens the world of beautifully, artfully posed, extravagantly dressed, heavily made up, eternally young women. And that'll be the still here. And also, thank you for including this still on the poster, advertising the lecture. But this is the day job. And this is Thomas being rude to his models, whom he treats as if they were simply mannequins that can be boiled, can be bullied, and badmouth all he wants. But anyway, you've seen this. And then Thomas's book, which we're going to see the clip of in just a minute, which instead of this, it does the opposite. It documents the wretched underside of London's mod scene, the naked and decrepit bodies of elderly men preparing for bed in a flop house. And if you can think of the difference, these young, beautiful, clothed women who consent to be filmed and who bespeak eternal youth, and the men who do not consent at all. Thomas's camera was hidden as he himself dressed in ragged clothes and spent the night in the flop house. And we're going to see them naked or partially clothed and leading toward the opposite of the notion of the eternal youth expressed here. So with Julian's help, this will be our next visual.
You want to use a lock? Don't you like him? Great. We use 3 or 4. Spread through the book? No, altogether. Yeah. And a pint?
Yes, sir.
Which one last?
None of this lot. I've got something fab for the end, in a park. I only took them this morning, I'll get them later on today. It's very peaceful, very still. Well, the rest of the book will be pretty violent, so I think it's best to end it like that. Hmm?
Yeah, that's best. Rings true.
One of Freccero's strategic moves in this essay is to seize upon the implications of the book format of Thomas's art. The bound volume fixes the procession of photographs into an immutable sequence and focuses our attention on the principles of formal structure and the order of the whole. In preparing his volume of photorealism, Thomas is authoring his own book of life, and its focus on decrepit old men and the decaying cityscape means that his book's referent is the truth of the human condition, the mortality lurking beneath the masquerade of glamour, fashion, and eternal youth of late 1960s London. Given the bleakness of the book's representation of the human plight, it's curious that Thomas would choose to give his photo montage a, quote, happy ending, that the final page of his book would be the amorous tryst that he thinks he has photographed in the park. Of course, we know that his happy ending is comprised of the falsest image in the book, the dalliance that is really the setup for murder. Far from the mortality-denying romantic idol that Thomas thinks he's captured, the book's final shots emerge as the most violent and death-affirming of them all, for they lead Thomas ultimately to the corpse, the true referent of the images in this photorealist book of life. And Julian, this will be the next. Yes. This is, and we can hardly see it, it's dropped on the floor because whoever came and marauded the Thomas's studio of all the photographs, one slipped behind the refrigerator onto the floor. And so we're seeing this then. And it's like a pointillist, collage, really, of points of light and darkness. Now, I'll let you look at that just for a moment, because it's worth contemplating. Okay. By elevating Thomas's authorial aspirations to the foreground of his analysis of the film, then, Freccero makes the film medium itself a privileged vehicle for thinking about the most consequential operations of narrative structures and the life stories to which they give form. In so doing, his thought converges with Pasolini's in the filmmaker's great essay called, quote, Observations on the Shot Sequence, end quote, where editing provides the all-important analogy to the structuring of a life story from the perspective of the ending. Quote, death achieves a lightning-fast editing job on our lives. In other words, it chooses its truly significant moments, no longer modifiable by other possible contrary or incoherent moments, and puts them in sequence, making of our present infinite, unstable, and certain, and therefore not linguistically describable, into a past that is clear, stable, certain, and therefore describable. Solo grazie alla morte la nostra vita serve ad esprimerci. Thanks only to death, our life serves to express us. That's Pasolini. This insight is familiar to all of us who studied with Freccero and knew his thoughts about the impossibility of writing authentic autobiography without the detachment and closure that only a symbolic death can provide. But it was the analogy with editing that brought the retrospective structuring power of death into sharp focus for Pasolini. For Pasolini, editing is the result of a completeness, an afterness that authorizes us to select, coordinate, and implot events in order to justify the endpoint to which they lead. Editing, then, is the quintessential instrument of ex post facto knowledge, the device by which retrospective understanding manifests itself in cinematic form. During the climactic sequence of developing, exhibiting, and blowing up the images that he shot, and we're going to be looking at this footage in just a moment in great detail, Thomas significantly lacks that a priori vantage point that makes possible the editing of a story. The thickness and layeredness of the sequence that we'll be watching, the fact that it is about editing, specifically about what happens when the continuity of time and space is broken up and its fragments are rearranged according to a logic which transcends the strict laws of contiguity and chronology. This needs no belaboring here. What does need belaboring is the way in which Antonioni radically reverses the relationship between knowledge and editing, so that it's the process itself that leads Thomas to decipher the underlying meaning of the images he has shot. Professional film editors, of course, know the logic of the plot beforehand, and this is what guides them then to assemble the film's footage accordingly. For Thomas, instead, it is casual positioning of the photographs displayed along a wall which forces his images to give up their secrets. In other words, in juxtaposing and rearranging these images as they incrementally reveal their clues to him, Thomas is making his own film. And if you think about what a film strip is, at least in the analog, the pre-digital age, a film strip, if you unwind it from the reel and you hold it up, it's a series of juxtaposed stills that, once in a projector and going through the projector 24 frames per second, simulates smooth movement in time and space. Needless to say, the meta-cinematic awareness that Antonioni is in turn making a film about Thomas's making a film will not be lost on viewers. And so editing thus emerges as a privileged form of knowing, allowing Thomas to penetrate the surface of events to discern beneath the appearance of an amorous tryst the reality of a murder most foul. Though the protagonist himself, he's very two-dimensional. He has an undeveloped psyche in the film, if any psyche at all, and a very cryptic demeanor. Nonetheless, we identify him in his dogged quest for truth. And as we watch the clip, I want you to notice a few things in particular. The way Antonioni is going to involve us intensely in Thomas's process through a relay of gazes that cut across and through layers of imagery as the camera will pan across the images that have been blown up, have been developed, and are going to be along the wall. I also want you to notice there's a lot of very intricate back and forth between subjective camera, where we're looking straight through Thomas's eyes, and then objective camera, where Antonioni is pulling back and showing us Thomas looking at the photographs. I want you to notice how within the photographs then, it's going to be this inner glance of the woman, the very mysterious woman in these photographs, and how she's exchanging that glance with somebody else who's going to be hidden in the bushes. And so her glance within what we're going to see is reciprocated by somebody at first mysterious and hidden, who eventually is going to emerge thanks to the blowing up process. And so this gaze then within the photographs we're going to see is then going to generate a curious and gradually more and more enlightened gaze on the part of Thomas. And then it's going to generate the gaze of the cinematographer who's doing the work for Antonioni himself. But one thing to think about as you watch this clip is that Antonioni has a very restrained authorial presence here. That is, Antonioni does not make us privy to any information that Thomas doesn't have, so that we can't look at Thomas from a superior position of condescension and say, oh, you haven't figured this out, but we know it. No, Antonioni does not do that. There is no cognitive gap then between us as viewers of this segment and Thomas, and so we are closely aligned with his gaze. All right, so this is a 6-minute clip, and it can be tedious, it's very technical, but I think when you think about what is going on here, and every now and then I will be freeze framing my version of the clip, which is on here. So at this point, then I guess, here we go. So at first we were seeing subjective camera. We were seeing through Thomas's eyes as he looked and himself looked back and forth at the two contiguous photographs exhibited in his studio. And then we see Thomas himself, so we're getting back to objective camera. When we hear those footsteps, we're hearing him go back along a corridor into the two labs where he'll be working and doing the developing and the blowing up. And here we are again in subjective camera. Back to objective. Now, if you can hear the soundtrack, it's like a very low whirring of wind and maybe trees. And with that soundtrack, Antonioni is showing us that Thomas is somehow back in that park. He's taking himself back to that park, triggered by his own viewing of the photographs that he took. Now, this is something I found very intriguing. How can this camera shot look at Thomas from behind the photographs? Well, what I realized is that these photographs are hung from a beam, from a rafter, and they're not against the wall. But the corner wall next to it is actually a wall, a flat, plain wall. And so, but this lets Antonioni get some interesting shots here that otherwise he wouldn't be able to get, where it's almost as if we're surveilling Thomas on the other side of these two screens, which are the photographs themselves. Now he's making his own musical soundtrack. This is a very Antonioni moment where he's fascinated. He loves ornamental moments in films, and the beautiful glass work that he's showing and that beautiful mineral. But what's going to happen is that the magnifying glass, in addition to being something beautiful to look at as a piece of glass, is going to become a tool for Thomas's investigation. Something to notice here, that he's posted them in the wrong order, and it's only through subsequent editing that he'll be able to reverse that mistake, as you'll see. It's coming. Now we got the order right. Okay. Thank you. All right, so this relay of gazes that I mentioned, ours as it intersects Thomas's, as it intersects with that of the criminal couple within and across the still photos, enacts the important work of suture, defined as, quote, the mechanism whereby the spectator is stitched into the multitude of shots and spaces on the screen, thus becoming formulated as a subject while imposing a coherent unity upon the complex images on the screen, end quote. Suture draws us inexorably into Thomas's interpretive process. We share the protagonist's intense investment then in proving the authenticity of his images. And when the referent dematerializes and Thomas fails to get the social corroboration needed to prove his photographic truth, he goes to the party, and Ron, there, his editor, is too stoned to really care to help Thomas. We spectators are stitched into this experience of failure and loss. Once we arrive at the final blow-up of the corpse, as we saw earlier in the still, that of a pointillist arrangement of dots, Antonioni reveals what I have called the crisis of photographic belief. By photographic belief, I'm referring to the naive faith in photography's power to visually reproduce the object world. But residing at the heart of Blow Up, I believe, is this crisis of photographic belief. And it's summed up by the words of Antonioni himself, quote, we know that beneath the revealed image there is another one, more faithful to reality, and beneath this still another, and one more other, up into the true image of reality itself, absolute, mysterious, which no one will ever see, or perhaps the decomposition of any image at all, or any reality at all. In this sense, even abstract cinema would find its raison d'etre. At the end of the film, that's the end of the quote. At the end of the film, as Freccero has shown, Antonioni parts company with his protagonist. Thomas is obliterated from the screen moments after he retrieves the errant tennis ball of the mime's phantom game, signaling his abdication of the quest for reference. The photographer can no longer serve as the filmmaker's surrogate. And here I'm quoting from Freccero's essay. For Thomas's collaboration is the sign that he has joined the ranks of talented perpetrators of illusion. And then he disappears both as a person and artist, leaving Antonioni his lonely search for truth, end quote. If I were to take a step back and apply Freccero's lesson on Blow Up to a wide-angle view of cinema studies as a whole, the conclusion would be this. Film should not be relegated to the realm of the unserious or the dangerously false. In other words, should not be relegated to the imaginary tennis game of Antonioni or the back wall of Plato's cave in Bertolucci. By critically examining its own language and warning us against the entrapments of image culture, cinema can serve as a form of inoculation or homeopathic cure. It took Freccero's landmark essay to persuade me and my colleagues not only of the validity of making film criticism a serious part of our curriculum, but of the necessity to do so. And now, nearly 6 decades after, we're still feeling the impact of this breakthrough achievement. But I'd like to leave you with this parting thought concerning the urgency of Freccero's essay today. Living as we are in the midst of the digital revolution, Freccero was writing in a time of analog technology, when the photographic image was accorded the status of referential truth due to chemical process that I could explain to you later. It's a little bit technical, but later in the question and answer. But this was a status to which Thomas himself, we saw, heroically dedicated his quest and blow-up. Today, no referential status can be ascribed to the photographic image. In our current digitized world, we're continuously and addictively exposed to images where CGI, photoshopping, deep fakes, and the like render obsolete and even quaint our impulse to locate photography's origins in the real. Thomas's quest for the referent of his shots in the park could well serve as an allegory for us today, uncertain about the truth claims of the images and their messages that flood our screens, large and small. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Day and night. For Freccero, though, the truth claims of a film like Antonioni's adhere not so much in the veracity of the images themselves as in the profound human truths that cinematic storytelling, when ethically conceived and expertly interpreted, can yield. I leave you then with the following hope: to have fully justified the title of my own talk tonight, John Freccero and Blow Up, the lecture that changed my life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Penny. We are so grateful to John that changed your life and to the fact that he converted you to film studies, to which you gave such dignity and depth throughout your career. And I think now you're going to take a few questions from,
Yes, it would be wonderful.
from the audience.
Yes.
And I think one is right.
Any questions?
Oh, no.
Leonardo, do you want to talk about the Cortázar story?
Because we were talking earlier when she kindly came to meet us, and thank you for that. I was just curious if you were going to mention the differences with the story. From what I remember from the story is the protagonist is a translator and a writer, and he's in Paris and he's a Latin American writer, and I think that's the same central concern with the deceptive nature of image making and objective knowledge and the dimension of vision and knowledge. But the whole fiction is constructed discursively through language, and it's very much a literary concern in that sense. And Antonioni took that more literally and made it about the gaze. And one thing that struck me is that the fact that he set the story in London in the 60s, and this character is so bored and is experiencing this ennui, and what awakens him is exactly when the moment when the image, in a sense, fights back. Because he's so dominant, he is the bearer of the male gaze, especially in that famous image from the poster. He is like literally enacts violence, visual violence on his female subjects, and he's so bored with his own power, and the moment that that power is challenged, that sort of visual and epistemic power. His curiosity is aroused, but then there's no resolution to it. I was wondering
Yes.
if that,
Right.
yeah.
No, that's a beautiful point. And Leonardo is himself a translator, so so he knows, so the obvious interest. Oh, who's the Oh, okay. But you're interested in adaptation, which is a form of translation. Absolutely, yeah. So that very interests, and it's curious that Freccero did not focus on that. It might have taken him away from some of the larger issues that he wanted to concentrate on. Yeah. David, in your piece, where are you, David? Yeah. Did you talk about the adaptation of the Cortázar?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I start talking
I'd
about
love to
that.
hear what you have to say about that.
Well, just that in the adaptation, I think Leonardo didn't mention that, he does take a photograph, and he sees, the scene he sees in Paris on the Seine, on the banks of the river, is an older woman seducing a younger man. So it's kind of, that's reversed in the Antonioni thing. And there's, he captures in the photograph somebody who's kind of off looking at them. And what he says is he's, by intervening, the woman comes to him and he runs away. He's saved this man from some terrible destiny. We don't know what it is, but it's some kind of sexual torture that he's going to undergo. I think the difference is that the blowing up of the photograph is right at the end, and it's not really the centerpiece of the story. Whereas in the Antonioni film, and this is, you probably know this, Calvino played a big part in this. Antonioni wanted to recruit Calvino as a co-screenwriter alongside Tonino Guerra.
Oh, my goodness.
And Calvino wrote him a letter back, which I've read because it's in the Antonioni archive in Ferrara. Said, I'm sorry, I'm too busy, I can't help, but I really like the treatment. If I were you, I would make the blowing up of the photo the center of the film. And in his original treatment, Antonio hadn't made it central. So that whole wonderful sequence that you've shown us is something, in a way, we owe that to Calvino. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Oh, wonderful. I think, thank you so much for telling us about your essay, which I think will interest us all, especially given Fraccero's work on it and the way we've been able to look at that particular scene as well. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have other questions? Yes, Luciana.
I was wondering whether the Garden of the Finzi-Cattinis could have been made without this first.
Could have been made without, I'm sorry.
Without blow up first.
Without blow up.
Oh, but that's a different director.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, interesting about the blow up. What struck me most about, and I just recently taught Garden of the Finzi-Contini, and in terms of camera technique, De Sica was just in love with the zoom,
Yes.
the close-up itself, and so and my students for whom now we're used to a little bit more subtle techniques were taken aback by that. They thought it was just too heavy-handed. But yeah, so that film was made in 1970 by De Sica, and so that technology itself, was Italian directors were going crazy with it. Yeah. So and it is true that we are seeing the zooming in. Here it's Thomas himself zooming in right through the blow-up process. Yeah. So that's a very interesting point. The whole idea of blowing up and zooming in with the camera lens. Thank you. Yeah, really.
And I couldn't help, but I find out today from Paola that her grandfather, Alfredo, was a passionate and almost compulsive photographer. He was a barber by trade, but he took thousands of photographs that the family still has of New York in the 30s, right? So 20s and 30s. So John was surrounded by this stack of photographs.
Yeah, I mean, Alfredo was an amateur photographer by his own description, but his photographs are beautiful.
Do you have them?
They're very cinematic, yes.
Are they?
They're very cinematic in their capturing of New York. And I wonder, I hadn't really thought about it before, but I wonder how much that would have influenced. It certainly influenced my father in terms of his love of the image. Whether or not it actually translated into his sort of then later, kind of academic study of film, I don't know. But yeah, Alfredo was quite the photographer, and he loved to capture, I would almost say, kind of absurd moments. I don't know how to describe it. I was telling Stefano earlier today that he had this photograph of a raccoon on top of a flagpole at Central Park, which, sort of, like, what are the chances, right, of anyone seeing a raccoon in Central Park, but especially not on top of a flagpole? And, sort of weird moments of construction and strange. But he also had typical photographs, like beautiful photographs of my grandmother with my father. And so, yeah, I think there might be something in the blood when it comes to the image.
Have you ever thought of making these public in some way?
It's funny that you should say that. So I just packed up and sold his house in California, and it was during that process that I found most of these incredible albums. That the other thing is, my grandfather also, not only did he take voluminous pictures of New York, he also put them into albums and annotated them. So I have dozens and dozens of them, and I didn't get the chance before I packed up the house to actually do anything with these photographs, but I would love to. I would love to see them live on somewhere.
I mean, and they're archival, among other things. Yeah. They really are. Yeah. But his obvious eye, the cleverness, the things that he's able to focus on, and also documenting that time. Yeah,
it was a very seminal time in New York, and also a seminal time, obviously, in his life. And I think also where Alfredo had a wicked sense of humor, and my grandmother did not really. And so I think that's where my father perhaps got his twinkle, his sense of humor might be from Alfredo, who was very visually focused.
That's wonderful.
Do you have any other question or comment on Professor Marcus' talk?
Or about Fraccero's life?
Thank you, Penny. This was fantastic. And I have kind of a comment and a question. And of course, as you know, I'm not a cinema studies person. So really my sort of question here is maybe basic and really out of curiosity. But what fascinates me among the many things you showed us, well, first of all, you're doing a fascinating reading of a film, which is a film about, in fact, someone who's doing a sort of film. So I think you have been doing a very beautiful exercise in interpretation, mirroring in a way what happens with the film. And this was beautiful and beautifully done.
You. Oh.
And then I thought that one interesting aspect that you showed to us is the question of editing, right? Because of course, that moment when he rearranges things, the images, it's so powerful even for, scholars who work with texts, right? Because, and of course, this is very true of both you and also of Professor Freccero. You're both people who have clearly an interest in films, but also, very aware of the, problems which sort of reading a text brings up. And I'm wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about your particular take as a scholar of both texts and films, about this big question of how to deconstruct things and reconstruct them for the sake of, for instance, presenting them to an audience. I think there are so many similarities in what you have done as a scholar tonight with what's happening in the film. And I assume this would be, of course, a great question for Professor Freccero as well.
Yeah.
But, if you have thoughts about this cluster of editing-related sort of issues.
Yes. Well, this is huge. Yeah. And as I was saying to the graduate students today, I have never made a film. And, I shouldn't confess that. And Leonardo, again, you were talking about having two different mindsets. Do you mind sharing that again?
This counts as part of your comments exam.
Okay. Yes, exactly. Yeah, the exam is waived because he's doing it right now.
Well, I just, I think my comment was about that when people do study the theory and history of film and also do a little bit of the practice of it, oftentimes they inhabit two different kind of consciousness, and then because when directors study other films, filmmakers study other films, they look at like the choices in terms of like, it's very craft-based, does it convey more than abstract ideas, the emotional, what the characters want, is everything legible, it's about the sort of subliminal effect on the audience. That doesn't mean that then there isn't other stuff, and when scholarship is done, it's more about there is an element of reception that it's the meaning of it, that a text, a visual text, acquires regardless of the intention of the author, of course, and it happens with other media as well. And so I do find myself that I have to bridge two different consciousness when I write about. It's interesting.
Well, and so that really resonated with me. And since I've never made a film, I'm absolutely in wonderment when I think about, and I now, because with the DVD digitization, that we can do frame analysis, and when I see the difficulty of setting up a shot alone, and then of course all of the difficulty finally of editing, and then I think a lot about Freccero's ideas about how do you put together fragments into something that is coherent and a simulacrum of time, which is what storytelling is as well. And so one of the things that I tackled was adaptation itself, and the problem of teaching adaptation, and the problem of facing readers of their favorite novel, for whom there's this terrible sort of idea that the film is a transgression, that it's a profanation, all the ways that the film can never live up to the literary text, and therefore the film is to be absolutely dismissed as anything possibly legitimate, as a possible form of interpretation. And so I set up what I call the adaptive triangle. It's a little bit, it's sort of gimmicky, but anyway, at the bottom of the triangle, there's the literary text at one point, and the filmic text at another. And at the top is what I hypothesize as a kind of pre-narrative idea, shorn of any particular embodiment in any particular artistic form. And so so the good adaptation would begin at the text and would move up one side of the hypotenuse up to the top, and would take the pure idea, and shorn of any particular material embodiment. And then from that point, go down the other hypotenuse to what would lend that idea to cinematic representation. And so to think of the text and the film as equal at the bottom of this, but as both reinventing, rewriting, retranscribing an idea, a narrative idea, into medium-specific language. And so that's been helping me a lot to think about the kinds of questions you were mentioning about somebody who's trained in literature, as Freccero and as I was, never having taken a film course and certainly never making a film. And so the whole question then of interpretation, and interpreting one kind of language and another kind of language, and then sometimes in the case of adaptation, comparing without judging, without sort of any kind of hierarchy of better or worse, but comparing them as simply different languages and different modes of conceiving of ideas. Anyway, that's a whole other lecture course.
We'll have you back, Penny, don't doubt it. And I think also on behalf of the Italian department, we couldn't have hoped in a better inaugural John Freccero lecture than Penny Marcus and her talk on Blow Up. And let me thank once again Paola and the Freccero family for being here with us for this celebration. This is really a celebration and a tribute. And of course, Dr. Thomas Bellezza and Mr. John Jensen, through their generosity, their very generous gift, this lecture series is assured to continue in time. And Tom Bellezza is an accomplished cardiologist, but he also sat in the classes of Professor Freccero, and that's where their friendship developed with John through several dinners, drinks, and many more convivial moments. And I think this is a beautiful way for you to perpetuate your friendship, and we're all very grateful for that. Thank you all very much for being here with us. Thank you.